Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the semifinals of the FTX Crypto Cup. We have Magnus Carlsen and Teimour Radjabov, and we have Nepo and Wesley So. So we are potentially on pace for a Magnus versus Jan final, and obviously they are playing in the World Championship match later this year in November. Because this is the semi-final round, there are not as many crazy games. If you were watching the quarterfinals, then you will know that I had to cover 8 games in one day. We will start with So versus Nepo, and then we will finish with Carlsen Radjabov. All lower seeds eliminated the higher seeds, by the way. 5, 6, 7, and 8 are all right there. Timestamps on the video player, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. We will kick things off with the first game between Wesley and Jan. We have e4, and Jan goes back to the French defense. This is very uncommon to consistently play the French defense at this level. Why? Number one, AlphaZero trounced the French defense. So the French is not really seen as much at this high level because there's better options on move 1 for black to play, like the Sicilian, or e4, e5, and all those, symmetrical positions. But Jan understands that human beings are not computers, and just because the computer finds ways to systematically get advantages against the French, humans don't. So we have e5. This is known as the classical variation of the French defense. Black will be playing c5, and Wesley will play knight f3. And really, this position is kind of the theoretical tabia. Now here, black can play a lot of different ways. He chooses to play a6 to maybe play b5. And after knight to e2, we have a position that's been reached in like less than 5% of games. Normally, white just kind of continues natural development with queen d2, maybe bishop e2. Sometimes you castle long, sometimes you castle short, sometimes you play h4, h5. But we have knight e2. Idea of knight e2 is that you want a structure like this with c3. And you want to get your connect 4, because Wesley is obviously inspired by international master Eric Rosen. And then you want to play g3. So now you've completed the pyramid. The a pawn is the odd one out. But the pyramid is obviously a nice and structural advantage here. So black's counterplay in all of these close French structures has to do with the c pawn break and the f6 break. But also queenside counterplay with a5. Why? You have a majority of pieces here. A lot of pieces are on this side of the board, whereas white's pieces are kind of more geared toward a kingside attack. So queen c2, we have our first trade in the center. Wesley takes back with the knight, and knight c5 blocks the dark squared bishop from targeting the queen. Rook b1, bishop d7, finishing development. Everybody's finishing development. Here we go. Jan jumps in. Knight e4. The first man to kind of cross the halfway point of the board for the black pieces, jumps in, starts attacking things. King h1, prophylactic move, moving the king out of the way of the queen, this knight, this bishop, bishop c5, bishop d3, and now the center begins exploding. We have knight d4, and that key pawn break that I talked about earlier, f6. If you were to take, which is exactly what Wesley did, rook f6, you get a nice little barrier right here, and you would love to transfer your knight there, but the second you move your knight, I take your bishop, and losing a bishop to gain good control of one square is not very good. Welcome to GothamChess recaps. So first we re-strengthen the bishop, and then we take the knight. And you would say, well, I don't understand. Isn't this just a really good position for white? White just won a pawn. Like, let's do the counting there. Take, I'm up a pawn. Not quite. Because your light squared bishop was very important. Why? Because 5 of your pawns out of 6 are on dark squares, which means your light squared bishop needs to cover the weaknesses. But now that you've given up your light squared bishop, and we trade, the light squares become very vulnerable. I'm about to activate this bishop and laser beam you. So now you got to scamper out, and you got to go for a queen trade. No queen trade. And by the way, if anybody's curious, yes, there is a hanging rook here, but the queen was hanging, so it needed to get out of the way. And also Jan is threatening queen h1. So now we get a king hunt. Bishop f6, queen h1, king f2, queen h2, king e3, queen g3, king d2, queen f4. This man just looted his entire house. He just took every pawn, and he did it with check, instant replay, 3 pawns down, and now I give you one more check for good measure to either deflect your king somewhere or make you offer a queen trade, and then I trade queens and I take your bishop, and now black has bishop and 2 pawns for a rook, and this position is super unclear. I mean, black has 3 passed pawns. Now, this position would be a lot better for black if the pawns were connected. Connected pawns always better. Work together better, shield you from checks better. Very imbalanced position. Jan begins to push his pawns. What does Wesley do? Super important, my friends. Rooks are bad alone. They're very bad alone. They need to be together. All right, they're like a dog that's sitting at home because you went to work. They need a friend. E5, rook g7. Another pawn is going to be pushed forward. Now, It looks like you can take on h5. The problem is that Jan is investing in his passed pawns. You understand? That's why he's okay giving the h-pawn away, because he knows his pawns are going to stand there together. So we have a check that forces the king back, and Wesley's more than happy to make a draw here, or is he? He's like, let me play this game on. There's no risk to play the game on. Double up f3, but again, because now the rooks are not working together on a straightaway, they're working together laterally. This is going to be very difficult to make progress. This is as far as the pawns are going to get. Now your king cannot go forward, and if you play a move like rook d3, it's very important you go up. Why? Because even though I get one score away from promotion, the king. Don't forget that at the end of the day, the king is the piece that is the most vulnerable. And Wesley so forces a repetition of moves because his alternative was to go back to h1, and that just loses. That loses to a couple of different things, but you should always look for checks for yourself and for your opponent. Rook f3 check would deflect the king away. You would lose your rook. Then you would lose your other rook to my pawn. And then I would make another pawn to promote, right? I'd make another pawn promote. And so for these guys, it's a draw, and they kind of understand it the whole way through. Jan gets his counterplay, very imbalanced endgame. This is the best result that we could get. Levy, you never cover draws. I know. But there's only 4 players left, so I had to cover the most exciting draw. Otherwise, this would have been a super long recap for no reason. I'm not one of these YouTubers that BS's you, okay? Every now and then I have an overly dramatic title, but I'm trying to give you guys the best kind of game. The next game of this match was a draw in 19 moves. Then they drew in 69 moves, which is nice. We're going to go to game number 4. The score of the match is 1.5, 1.5. All right, that is the score of the mini match. They've made 3 draws. This one was crazy. The third one was a little bit, also a French defense. Now Jan's got the white pieces, and he begins with a King's Indian attack. Knight f3, g3, bishop g2, castles. And he plays this move d3. Then he plays knight d2 and e4. This is the King's Indian, but colors are flipped, right? So now rook e1. And essentially what happens in these positions is white allows black to play d5, c5, b5, a5, a4, b4, etc. And you go all out over here. You bring all your pieces, and when you play this with white and you get into this close center position, someone's going to lose the game, okay? So you see everything that I'm saying, white solidifies the center. You're going to try to create some attack here. Generally, these positions are actually preferred. Computers prefer them for black. They actually don't see white's attack, but obviously, humans are not computers. So knight e3, bishop b7, c4. So Jan is kind of trying to do this both ways. He's trying to make Wesley completely close the center, so that way now I go this way, and then h5, and then h6, and then etc., right? If I can close the center, it'll be a lot harder for you to transfer your resources to defend your king. It's like a naval blockade, all right? If you're a history professional in the chat, in the video, in the comments, you're probably going to be like, that's not actually how naval blockades work. Look, I don't know, all right? I'm a guy who makes chess videos on the internet. Now, you'll notice Wesley kept the position open. His knight is able to jump in. His queen is active. His bishop's active. His knight can come to the middle. That's what you need to not get attacked on the king side, okay? You need to keep the center more open because you're able to create counterplay. All right, so Jan has to focus on this side with moves like knight to c2, disallowing, just full destruction over there. And now he plays bishop g5. The point of this is that if takes, you have h takes, but also knight takes, and you're just going for this. Oh, not there, to e4 and then this way. So Wesley, see the benefit of not closing the center? His bishop still sees the whole board. At any moment, he can also trade the queen. He can come and say, no queen trade for you. And that's exactly what we get. We get a massive trade-off in this position. Okay, now if you plug this position into an engine, what is it going to tell you? 0.00. If this was a classical game, the players might have even agreed to a draw. Now, I think white maybe has a slight advantage. Just a slight advantage. White has more space. In endgames, bishops are worth more than knights, but, white is more active with the rook, maybe a little bit more space with the pawns. But at the end of the day, the only way you can win this is winning one of these pawns and winning a super long endgame, or back rank checkmating your opponent, or hanging a knight fork. You could also lose, right? Now, for the intermediate or beginners watching, that's very possible. It's very unlikely this game ends in a draw, but at this level, there's still moves to be played. Wesley takes the pawn. Jan uses his h-pawn, sacrifices his h-pawn to damage the structure of the black position. Says, okay, I'm down a pawn. These are stupid. Wesley says, how dare you call my pawn stupid? So rook b4, I'm going to create lateral counterplay. King h6, you can't have my pawn. Jan's like, what do you mean I can't have your pawn? Now Wesley's like, now I'm going to use my pawn to damage your structure. Okay, bishop e2. I'm waiting. I'm not going to take. In fact, I want to play f4 to block your rook and then take with the rook. So what does Wesley do? Knight e7. Knight e7. And if you go for this plan with f4, now I have rook b2. I have knight f5. Knight f5 will defend my h4 pawn from your rook, right? So rook b2, knight f5. Oh, my arrow drawing is just super off today. So we get rook takes h4 and a trade. But the problem is now Wesley's flank pawn break weakened this. Hopefully you can use this in your endgames. These h-pawn breaks to break up the structure. So what happens? Jan trades and gives away the e-pawn and brings back the bishop. Knight n3 versus bishop n2. Most of the time, this will end in a draw because these pawns will not break through these pawns. The f and h won't break through f and h. And if everything gets traded, I can just sack my bishop for the last pawn. Beginners, keep that in mind. Why? Because king and knight alone cannot mate a king. So you can sacrifice your bishop and not allow anything to promote. Now you'll notice as the endgame progresses, not too much is happening. One guy is activating his king. It's very important that Wesley blocks out Jan's king from entering and then tries to activate his own king, which is sort of what he's doing. See, the knight is hopping around and along with the h-pawn, you're not allowing the king to come forward and you're also not allowing trades. For example, f5 might lead to some, draw an endgame. For example, take. Like maybe this is a draw. In fact, I do believe it is because I think after h5, it's quite simply a draw because black is too passive despite being a pawn up, okay? Hopefully you guys are learning. Being active in the endgame is important, but black is not going to trade. Black's not interested in trading unless it's advantageous and plays h5. Now your king can't come forward. King c5, you see? Wesley's activating the king. He's bringing the king. Now, what's interesting in this position, Jan had to play king f2, I think, because on king d4, he would be able to play king f3. He had to await the move king d4 and land on f3, and it mattered where his bishop was. And because after king d4, he still went to f3, the problem is that now knight f5 is going to come in some position, and knight h4 will be a check. Like, now, for instance, here, we got king d3, and you can't move your king because now I get closer. It was like the ever so slight difference. Now bishop a4, knight f5, and your king is geometrically cut off from this. See, if his bishop had stayed here, awaiting the move knight f5, he can't do it anymore. Because this is a fork. He can't take the pawn anymore. You understand? So, if he had just played king f2 here, king f3, king d3, there would have been bishop b1 check. But the way that he did this and wasn't able to transfer his bishop to g6, because Jan played the move bishop b3, he wasn't able to make that check in time. One square makes all the difference for drawing this game. And because of that, Wesley's able to win a second pawn, use checks, and now the knight holds everybody. Look at this brutal geometry. And Jan is now down 2 pawns, and yeah, being down 2 pawns is game over in this endgame. And his bishop gets trapped. His bishop just gets trapped. Everything is guarded. Bishop runs behind the pawns and gets the door shot on it, and the game is over. So Wesley wins today's mini match 2.5, 1.5, which means that tomorrow Jan must win in the Rapid to force a Blitz playoff and potentially an Armageddon. Which takes us to our main event of the evening, ladies and gentlemen. Magnus Carlsen, the man who knocked out arguably the second best player in this format in this event in the quarterfinal. Potentially his biggest rival has been eliminated already. He must be feeling on top of the world. Teimour Radjabov made 7 draws and defeated Anish Giri in a very, very, very tough game. So he had a little bit of a different route. Yeah, Carlsen had 6 decisive results, actually 8 out of 10 games, and Teimour had 1 out of 8. So something's got to give. You got a locomotive and a what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? They make 2 draws to start the match. So I'm going to take you to game 3 of the Rapid. Magnus has the white pieces, and Teimour goes for the patented King's Indian defense. Knight f6, g6, bishop g7. So what he plays? Teimour is known for this. Magnus goes for a fianchetto. There is no better way to suck the soul out of a King's Indian player than playing the fianchetto or fianchetto or fianchetto King's Indian defense. So we have c5, bishop g2. And basically, Teimour wants to create some chaos. You'll notice he's playing in a very strange way, not moving his knight or bishop, not his pawns. The queen is targeting this. And Magnus just blunders it. Magnus just completely I'm joking. He's hitting this. He offers a trade. Now his pawn sidesteps danger, and he castles his king. So now what? Completely symmetrical position. Everybody has d through h pawns, right? A, B, queen is here, bishop is here. How do you get an advantage in this position? First, let's utilize the black's positioning of the queen to get development. And now, you see, trading that dark squared bishop. And a few moves later, that bishop does come off the board. Magnus expands in the center, takes some center space, checks the king, and now the king goes back. Now here, white is comfortably better. Why? More space, much more active pieces. Queen is much better than this queen. Potential access to the open file. What is this knight even doing? Magnus says, yeah, that's a great point. What is this knight doing? If it goes to h6, I play g4, that knight is out of the game forever. That knight is, I don't know how it's going to ever get back into the game. I can also just attack it and force your king out. So he goes this way, but now, again, Magnus is just, this is called an initiative. I mean, he's just making attacking moves that improve his position. The knight has to dance over to c4. The problem with that is you've just springboarded my center attack. e5. Okay, queen b6, king h2. Sure, we can trade queens, and we do trade queens. I still have a dominant control of the center of the board. Okay, but credit to Teimour, he traded one of his passive pieces. Actually, Magnus's queen was very, very powerful. Bishop e8. Now we have b3, the only weakness. And you would say, well, why didn't you just take this? He can take it, but maybe he was a little bit worried about rook b1. He didn't like some of the stuff that was looming there. Computer is very unafraid. It thinks that knight takes b2 is the best move. Teimour is not the computer. He makes a retreating move, gets hit with b3, and now Magnus just advancing. Knight, bishop, 2 rooks, knight, bishop, 2 rooks, 7 pawns each. How on earth do you find an advantage? Activity. And taking away the activity of your opponent. And as you notice, as the game progresses, even on backwards moves, Magnus has dominant control of the position. He's only got knight, rook, and bishop, but he wins a pawn. Say, why didn't Teimour guard his pawn? Not so simple, my friends. Remember, piece activity. d6 is killer. It hits the rook, and the pawn marches through. So Teimour had to part ways with his c-pawn. Magnus just begins advancing. And he just makes a bunch of forward moves. Rook c5, king g3, g5, and now he makes a backward move to make a forward move and continue to expand, and brings his king now. Great idea here by Teimour to create some sort of counterplay, but as the endgame approaches, Magnus wants a trade of rooks, and he goes for it. Teimour doesn't go for it, but every pawn in Magnus's territory went for a march this game. And he advanced, and rook c7, rook a8, and, well, here Teimour resigned. And sometimes I'm sort of flabbergasted how Magnus just makes his opponents look like they weren't even competing with him. I mean, Teimour is an exceptional player. He's in the semifinals. He has dominated some of these events, and he, in fact, won one of these events, and that was effortless from Magnus. Magnus up 2-1. And it all comes down to a couple of critical moments. Right here, Teimour had to be brave, take on b2. But that's the thing. Magnus gives you like one moment in the game to call his bluff. And he's not even worse. He's just, it's going to be equal, and your knight is going to be dancing out of the territory while the rook storms in. Very tough to see the counterplay. So now Magnus wins a relatively seamless third game, and it's up to Teimour now to win the fourth game. So of course he's going to take some risk. d4, knight f6, c4, e6. And we have a Rogozin, Queen's Gambit declined. If you've been watching any recap over the past few months, you've probably seen this opening on the board. Bishop g5, critical main line, h6 attacks, takes. And I guess what Magnus is going for here is, this is a very solid position. Like, you can play e3, black will castle, maybe play c5. Teimour says no. Let's begin the creation of imbalances. First of all, I attack you like this. You're not losing anything, but the knight is now in front of the c-pawn, which inherently is an imbalance of the structure. Now I play e3, castles, and rather than developing my bishop and castling, I'm going to solidify my knight with my rook, which is already down in the trenches of theory, not the most popular move. Queen g6. This move is designed to punish white for not having moved the bishop. Do you understand? You see how chess works? Oh, you didn't move your bishop? Well, now you can't. Because if you move it, I'm going to take this. Now, At this point in the database, there are still some games, but not on the next move. And ladies and gentlemen, if I preface this move by telling you what do super grandmasters do nowadays when they don't know what to do in a position, I believe this is Teimour's prep. I was not watching the games live, so I don't know how much time he spent on this move. He played h4. It seems like you can play this move in any position now. Now, at this point, there's like 3 games remaining in the database, and after rook d8, there's none. There's no games remaining. Magnus moves the rook, plays a natural move, and this is the point. I mean, Teimour just wants to play h5. And on queen f6, Teimour doesn't want to attack the bishop and force it to take. He doesn't want to go back and develop because now the queen's off. No, he wants to play rook to h4. Now, my friends, this is how you play when you've either done top-level computer preparation and played some training games, or when you had a few beers. And that's the beautiful thing about modern chess. You don't know. Maybe on the break, Teimour pounded down some Modelo's, or I don't know. My favorite beer, Stella Artois. I don't know what you guys drink. If you don't drink, then, well, rook h4. And the point of rook h4 is that you just want to go here. So what does Magnus do? What any human would do. e5. Activate your bishop and prevent rook f4. Now, computer here wants queen f5, preventing rook f4 because then you would take on h5. I don't know what Teimour had prepared on that. Maybe he would have played like bishop e2 and tried to just play g4. I don't know. I don't know. But we got e5 and now the center explodes. cd5, rook d5. You can't take the rook because you're pinned. So what do? You play this. Now bishop c3, rook c3, knight e5. Wait a minute. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, hello, whenever in chess games can you do stuff like this? Like, this is how beginners hang back rank mate. Now, I don't think Magnus hung queen e8, he has king h7, but now rook f4, and, folks, Magnus is in serious trouble. Look at the position. One guy somehow managed to bring 2 rooks into the action without even moving his king. This is like some legendary accomplishment. His bishop is standing by the king, though. It's like, hey, don't worry, I got your back. The other guy can't move 2 pieces. He just can't move. He moves the bishop, he's going to lose his rook. And, okay, he can move rook to b8, but I've seen more impressive things in my life than to move rook to b8. So bishop e2, and now Magnus plays f5. Why does he play f5? Wants to obviously control some center squares. Also, the rook will now no longer be able to pressure anything. And maybe there's some moment he can trade the queen. Like, again, Magnus would love to trade queens. Okay, knight to d4, now there's no queen trade. Pawn to c6. Basically not allowing the rooks any infiltration and covering the b5 square. But Teimour takes on f5. You can't take with the bishop because if you take with the bishop, I'm taking your rook. So now he's up a pawn and Magnus just says, all right, I know I'm not supposed to trade when I'm down material, but what am I going to do? That queen is harassing all my pieces. Bishop d7, rook e4, rook e8. How do you beat a guy when you're up a pawn against him with a space advantage? By taking more things away from him. Now the knight has to go back. And now you play bishop to d3. You are looking to trade pieces on your own terms. So he trades on his own terms, and now he plays b4. It's all about the pawn play, just like we saw last game. Sometimes the pawns, you look at this position, oh, bishop g6. Okay, but the only way you're going to win is by making progress with your pawns. So b4. Now bishop goes to g6, now a4. Taking squares away from your opponent, and sometime later, after you make some advancement, b5. You need to know how to utilize pawn play to create open lines and weaknesses. Rook to b2. Not going for a2, but going for b8. Sorry, not going for a6, but going to b8. Bishop e8, rook b8. This is 2 games in a row now. We've seen a depressed bishop on e8. They got to stop going there. All right, king f8, knight f5. One guy's absolutely dominated. So what do? Rook a8. He's got no more moves. Knight d5, and now the simplification process. Snap. Snap, snap, knight f4 check comes, and it does pick up the h5 pawn, which is very simple, g4, knight f6, and knight takes h6. Sometimes in endgames there are these tactics, the pawn is overloaded, and there's nothing to be done. If you take, you are simply two pawns down in a rook endgame, you might be named Magnus Carlsen, you ain't saving this. I mean, maybe against me, but even I would win that endgame. Rook in 3 versus rook in 1, at a certain level, if you don't manage to win it, maybe chess is not really the game, maybe checkers where all the things move the same. So now all Teimour has to do is simplify and solidify his structure, and he does. He gets the knight endgame, and on move 54, Magnus Carlsen resigned. The only way you can screw this up if you're playing with white is by doing this. Okay, for my beginners, Don't allow a sacrifice. We saw this earlier in the endgame with Jan and Wesley, I believe. Don't allow a sacrifice from multiple pawns because you need these pawns. So you need to bring the knight, advance, bring everybody. Only lose one pawn for the knight, not both, because king and knight cannot checkmate the king, right? And so with that, Radjabov tied the match. It seems like that's how you got to beat Magnus. Strong opening preparation. Hikaru won 3 rapid games with very good opening preparation, fresh ideas. H4, H5, freaking rook H4, some drunk style chess, and Teimour wins in very, very convincing style, getting Magnus out of his preparation with some wild idea. And what more to say? Pretty exciting first day of the semifinal. Folks, as always, it's a pleasure making these for you. And I've been reading your comments, so keep leaving them. Hoodie season is gone, so now listen, I've been stocking up my shirts. Some of you are very, very negative about some of these shirts. I'm gonna keep wearing them, so you know, you might as well turn the negativity into positivity. And if you're positive about the shirts, well, boy, do I have a whole collection of them in store until it gets cold again. Tomorrow, 2 of these players will be eliminated and sent to the 3rd and 4th place match, and 2 of them will move on to the finals of the FTX Crypto Cup. Get out of here.